how can someone get better at recordings and make sounds, I think what they're saying is, how can someone get better at the recording, better sound when it's being recorded so that they fit together? And if you're not asking that, sorry for misunderstanding you, but I think maybe to answer your question, this might be a good way to think is, I think a lot of people now, in my generation and later, we've always just recorded to the DAW, and our main concern, if I'm speaking from my experience early on, was just, all right, I just want to make sure nothing clips, and if I do that, then it's a good recording. But now I'm starting to see that it's actually the earlier on in the signal chain you move, the better. I think one of the main problems I see with questions and just the experience of our viewers is like, how do I fix this problem with mixing tools? And actually, I'm realizing that a lot of the problems you're trying to fix in the mix could have been fixed in the recording. And a lot of those problems could have been fixed in the player. And a lot of those problems could be fixed in the composition. And a lot of those problems could be fixed, even maybe earlier on than that. So I'm curious to know, how does someone make their end product sound better from the very beginning? What are some things you can do from the beginning? You already mentioned having processing on the way in, but maybe there's something even earlier than that.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's all therapy, right? Every therapist deals with people who are solving problems that happened a long time ago, right? Or previously, as you're solving new problems. So first, normalizing that experience. Can you flash the question back up on the screen, Kyle? Just because I want to make sure I'm addressing that.
Yeah. And
So
he goes on to say, talking about guitars and deciding on drum
yeah,
tone. So I think we
yeah.
are understanding the question properly.
I think so. I didn't mean to suggest we weren't. I just meant like I want to read it as I'm saying it, my answer, because when you get better at recordings, don't mix them. That's my advice. Don't mix it. When you're recording it, you're recording it. When you're mixing it, you're mixing it. Those are two separate things. But if you think of them as one continuum, which we typically do nowadays, because everyone mixes what they've just recorded, and they're recording while they mix, and you're doing it in Pro Tools. And Pro Tools has all these whiz-bang compressors and plugins and shit. It gets a lot easier when you stop trying to mix it and you just try to record it. And recording as a practice, it's about getting things to fit. I'll make an analogy, and then I'll get more specific. When you watch Bob Ross paint a painting, I'm just using Bob Ross because we've all probably seen a Bob Ross video at some point in our lives. He just makes it look effortless because every stroke he makes just seems like the right stroke. All right. Or if you watch any master artist, drawing a portrait, you're like, how does that line become that line? And then, oh my God, now that's a nose. Holy crap. Like you're seeing somebody who can predict the outcome of their movement, and they're moving fluidly through a process that they've spent a long time cultivating. And you're seeing a good painting in that moment, but there were thousands of shit paintings before. So just remember that, like, what you learn about mixing, any lesson you learn about mixing is actually a lesson in recording. And what you learn about mastering is definitely a lesson you're learning about mixing, and probably a lesson in recording too, to what you were saying, Kyle. It all goes back to that moment of inception. And at some point you kind of graduate into understanding that, like, the piece as it's conceived has to have clarity for it to exist in the world. You can have a feeling, right? And it can be amorphous and difficult to describe. But the minute you pick up an instrument or a paintbrush or a chisel, and you start to try to carve whatever that is out into the real world, now you got translation problems, right? And the more direct and clear you can be about what it is you're trying to make, the better the outcome of the product will be. And the best mix is one that needs nothing done to it. Right? It's already mixed. It's just like you're doing subtle changes, or where subtle changes exude a massive shift in the, that's kind of what you're trying to aim for. The way you do that is by being more clear when you first make a decision. And this is where learning about guitar tone and drum tone is so important. Hang out with guitar players, hang out with drummers, figure out what is it that makes the biggest difference in their playing, and make that happen at that stage. I'm fortunate to have worked in some of the nicest studios in the world. And even though those studios make every sound fantastic, they're not always the right sound. And you have to, when I was working at the power station, New England, you put up a drum mic anywhere, and you're like, "Oh shit, I'm a genius! This is great. Oh, here comes the Grammy." But then you put it in the context of the whole song, and you realize, well, it sounds great, but not for this song, or it's not the same as what I think they were shooting for. And usually that's because I didn't know what I was shooting for before I started. So, that's why sound check matters. That's why we do sound checks. But it's also why choosing the right engineer up front in a project is the most important thing to do, because those engineers have a history of getting a particular sound that they can reliably conjure, right? And part of learning this craft is like, what sound can you conjure? What are you capable of doing? What are your recordings? What do they sound like? What do you bring to the recording process? And when you get to a certain echelon of producer and engineer, one of the traits they always bring with them is clarity. And they're not going to take on a project that isn't clear, because there's more work to be done on the creative side. I think Rick Rubin talks a lot about this in his books and his writings about, working with artists and getting to the point, and being very clear about what it is you're trying to capture. Some of it's technical, but even when you get the technical right, if the other stuff isn't there, it doesn't matter you got the technical right. So, yeah, how can someone get better at recordings? You make a lot of them, and you make a lot of shitty ones, and you evaluate each one of them and figure out, what did I do wrong? Sounds will fit to the last thing I'm going to say that might be helpful in this is to be a student of how speakers work, and how do they reproduce sound, and know that from a technical perspective, because what you're trying to do is present an illusion that these instruments are real when your listener listens to them. And if you can understand the things that get in your speaker's way of producing good sound, then you can address those in the mix and in the recording phase, so that you're baking parts that fit together naturally, instead of making some rough stuff and then trying to carve them into fitting later. That usually doesn't work so well. So that's I tell my students that everything you need to know about audio, and getting better at the craft is the left speaker and the right speaker. Are they working together, or are they working not together? If you can understand and master that, then recordings tend to get better, because you understand what the technical obstacles are and you remove them, and it may result in what I find to be true, which is that I end up sculpting a shit ton of sounds, making them as wacky as I can on the front end, limiting what they are, not recording everything, but letting things be just the kernel of their truth, instead of, trying to kick that can down the road and let the mix engineer figure that out later. The sooner I can do that, the clearer every other decision becomes, because it's not waiting for a decision that's going to happen later, which I guess is an important part of this, right? If you wait till the end of your drum tracking to figure out what each individual drum is supposed to sound like, your drums aren't going to sound very good. You have to be very clear what you want each drum to sound like, and build them as best you can that way, to spec. And that's just your experience. It's practice. Join the club. It's a really fun club, full of losers. But we've lost enough times that we've dropped the football enough times that, we know how not to drop the football a lot of times.
That's what I'm really taking away from your answer. There's a lot of good stuff there, but I think that there's something to be said about walking down the wrong path.
Oh yeah.
Like you do a project and you're always going to make probably some mistake. And then the more projects you do, the more mistakes you've had to overcome. You've had to find ways around,
Well,
and then
then
hopefully in the future you adjust with that previous project in mind, and just do something differently.
yeah, I kind of want to, as you're saying it back to me, which is helpful. It's how you frame it. Like, it's not a mistake to make the wrong choice. It's Mistakes have a negative connotation to them. They're part of the creative process. It's not. It's I don't. I don't get upset when I make a mistake. I say, something to get better at right now. Like, what is that? And then I can focus on it. I love it when someone walks up to me and they're like, hi-hat's too loud, and then they walk away. And then, like, I turn the hi-hat down. I'm like, oh, that was the problem. Of course. Thank you. because that's a learning opportunity. This is the thing about this craft that has kept me wanting to do it for so long, is that every time I do it, I learn something new, or I make a choice and I realize it was the wrong choice, and that brings me back to clarity when I reckon with why. But it's not a mistake; it's just the process. And like the day we lose, that's the day we start, making pencils without erasers. Like no one likes a pencil without it. Like the only pencils that we use without erasers are on the golf course. You know what I mean? Like it's not.
Yeah. And I want to say one more thing, just so that it's a little bit more satisfying of an answer, because I know how frustrating it can be. You say, how can someone get better at recordings? And we just say, yes, you can get better sounds by thinking about your recordings. But again, it's so nuanced, and every single situation is probably going to be different. I think understanding the engineering side, like what tools are at your disposal. You've got the microphone selection, you've got the placement of the microphone. And I think just that in the recording world, experiment with that. You've got the drums in the drum heads. You can experiment with a lower tuning or a higher tuning, and just your brain will pick up on these things just through experimentation.
Mhm.
So I think learning what the handles are, what the knobs do, that's, I think, how you'll find for yourself how these things can work together. So
Mhm.
that's why I've always been a proponent of both theory and practice, because
Yep.
with just theory, yes, you're absolutely right that it won't get you as far as maybe just practice. But I think if you mix those two things together, you're going to get further than either could alone,
That's right.
because you understand what knobs are there to turn. And
Yeah.
yeah.